This will be the second in a series of videos discussing the 10 Oxherding pictures, or the 10 bulls, which are a series of Japanese woodblocks that describe in a poetic way the stages of realization or enlightenment. If you haven't seen the first in the series, I will put the link in the upper left-hand corner for you. So the bull or the ox represents the Dharma or the Tao or the eternal principle. You could also say it represents your true nature, although that terminology gets a bit problematic as realization deepens. However, if you perceive yourself as a separate entity in a world of things and people, in space and time navigating that world, then the sense of self should be investigated. In fact, this is where you have to start to take on the investigation into the deeper stages of realization. And that's what the second Oxherding picture addresses directly. The first Oxherding picture described coming into authenticity with the deeper truth that we are suffering. The second Oxherding picture describes the natural response to that recognition that we suffer. It's representative of when we start to get the taste that there's a way out of this, a way out of the suffering. It's not clear how that's going to work for us, or even that it's entirely possible for us as an individual. But we get a taste of something that is beyond the ordinary ways that we experience ourselves as a distinct, separate entity that seems to be struggling with its experience in an ongoing way. So here's the second Oxherding picture in its entirety. Number 2, finding the footprints. Along the riverbank, under the trees, I discover footprints. Even under the fragrant grass, I see his prints. Deep in remote mountains, they are found. These traces no more can be hidden than one's nose looking heavenward. Understanding the teaching, I see the footprints of the bull. Then I learn that, just as many utensils are made from one metal, so too are myriad entities made of the fabric of self. Unless I discriminate, how will I perceive the true from the untrue? Not yet having entered the gate, nevertheless I have discerned the path. These stanzas so beautifully delineate this part of the investigation of our true nature. What does it mean to find the footprints? When was it in your life that you finally got that taste that there's something going on here that's beyond the ordinary ways we talk about ourselves and life and achievement and success and even health and relationships? Do you remember something shining from beyond, from deep inside, something more real than what you had experienced previously as real? Sometimes it just takes one taste. And then we start looking around and noticing these footprints are everywhere. The path leads us deeper and deeper into our immediate experience. This might happen through reading, through interacting with a liberated being, through inquiry, through meditation practice. But we start to sense something that's leading us deeper, leading us beyond our beliefs and ideas about ourselves, about life, and even about spirituality. That's the footprint. That's the trail. It can be quite confusing at first because we still don't really know how to proceed But by grace, we've become aware of this, knowing this promise that is unspoken, and yet we instinctually know it's a promise that we can end our own suffering in this lifetime. For me, it was a lecture on Buddhism. When I was in college, I had a class on Zen literature and Japanese culture. And one day we had a substitute professor, and he was giving a lecture on Buddhism. And I had heard the terms he was using before and the principles, how we suffer, what causes the suffering, and then how we can end the suffering. And intellectually, I had already heard this, I'd already learned about this, but I never had a sense in the direct experience of right now that it's possible. And something about the way he was saying it, he was transmitting that truth to me, to the whole class, to anyone who would listen. And I remember him speaking about this, and it just hit me in a completely different way. It wasn't a subject. He wasn't teaching. He was pointing to something, almost like casting out the net and seeing who got ensnared in it. And I immediately raised my hand and I said, "Is that possible? What you're talking about, is that actually possible?" It was a challenge because I knew that he was transmitting something, and I knew that he knew he was transmitting something. And it felt very, very real. It felt almost out of this moment. Something that was sort of superimposed on this moment, or the moment and the story of what was happening in that classroom was superimposed on something more real that was coming to the surface. And he looked me in the eye and he said, "There is no doubt. There is no doubt." And he kind of smiled and he locked gaze with me for a second or two. I remember this clearly because he wanted to make sure that I knew that he knew what I meant and that the answer was yes, there is a way out. And that this shift in identity can occur for me. That is one of the most clear and succinct examples in my life of recognizing the tracks, of finding a footprint. There probably were others earlier on that were perhaps less obvious, and later on there were certainly more that came. But that was the one that really sticks out as the first one that really captivated me. And it was very powerful, but it was sort of like a seed that got planted. It wasn't like I immediately walked out of that classroom knowing I was going to find enlightenment one way or another if it killed me. I didn't quite have that conviction, but something shifted for sure. Something was perceived that I had never perceived before. And it was sort of like a seed just dropped deep inside me that started to germinate. And I started to look around. I think it was largely unconscious at that time, but something in me was looking, was curious, was investigating in a deeper way while I meditated, while I interacted with people, while I read. Something was at work. This is really how it is when we reach this second stage. In one sense, we do have a cognitive perception that we have discerned a path, that we're learning about how to wake up, that it's a possibility and we want to know how to do it and we want to learn the methods, and we join the ashram or the Zen center or meet a teacher, start watching videos. Whatever we do, we have the sense that we're on the path. But I think far more important than that is something vast, something even beyond our cognitive ability to be aware of its presence in a literal way, starts to operate in our lives. It's more like the ox becomes aware of you somehow. And so it starts to move around in the periphery in your life. The tracks become more prominent, more obvious, and more frequent, not because you're getting smarter or you're learning something about awakening or realization. That's the way the mind perceives it. But really, it's the grace of that bull becoming aware of that you're interested in its presence. And it starts to come closer, starts to walk around in your vicinity, and thus more and more tracks appear. I like the lines in the beginning of the first stanza that say, Even underneath the fragrant grass, I see his prints. This is important. What this is saying, in a poetic way, is that the drive to awaken, the drive to realize your true nature, is even primary to pleasure. A large part of you will still seek pleasure, of course, for a long time, but there's something even more primary, even through that scent of enjoyment or lust or seeking or desire, whatever it is. Even through that scent, that experience, you can still sense the tracks. There's something here, something to orient to. And then the stanza goes on to say, and even in the distant mountains, the tracks are found. This probably represents more like meditative practice, or when we're in solitude, or we're going inward, which is a very important part of practice at this stage for sure. But the point is, the tracks are all over. The tracks are everywhere if you're open to finding them, if you're curious enough, if you're vulnerable enough, if you're open enough. So be aware that those tracks can pop up anywhere, anytime, whether you're awake or asleep, whether you're in a mundane or a spiritual situation, whether you're meditating or cleaning your room, you can discover the tracks. This is the meaning of the second Oxherding picture. Later in the first stanza, there's the line that says, "These traces can no more be hidden than one's nose looking heavenward." This is such a beautiful way of describing what's more real than real. It reminds me of a quote I read many years ago, and hopefully I get the details right, but the gist of it's there. And that is, at one point, Sri Ramakrishna said to one of his students, Vivekananda, "I see God more clearly than I see your face." This is what it is to fall in love with these footprints. Not in a seeking way, but in a vulnerable, surrendered way. These tracks are more obvious than any thought you have about what's happening. In the second stanza, there's a reference to the various utensils being made of the same metal, and that the myriad of entities are made of the fabric of self. This is a clue. This is a clue into what it is you're investigating in this earlier movement of awakening. That first awakening, that first shift, is a transition from what we take ourselves to be initially, which is a series of thoughts and beliefs that's constantly threatened, always struggling, to the experience of pure consciousness, which everything you've ever known about, understood, seen, believed is made out of. Consciousness is exactly what you are, where you are right now. And it's everything that could be thought of, that could arise in this knowing space, and everything that could subside in this knowing space, and everything that ever has. This is pure consciousness. Now, at this stage, one has not realized this. This is not yet awakening, but the clues are there. And for him, it's a learning. For the little guy here looking around for his ox, he's learned this. He believes it or understands it. But the next line describes why this is still a challenge. He says, "Unless I discriminate, how can I know truth from falsehood?" And this is where the mind gets a hold of us. This is the reason we have to go beyond the conceptual, because any understanding will be turned into a principle. Any understanding will be turned into an object of thought, reifying the sense of the subject apart from the thought, the world, others, relationships, emotions, etc. So in this way, it's the discrimination in consciousness that we take for granted as being a necessary part of who we are and how we function. But indeed, it's not. So when we pick up a practice, especially something like self-inquiry or one-pointed practice, as I described in the book, we learn to not discriminate while practicing. We find the place where no discrimination occurs, no picking and choosing occurs, just the pure sense of I, or the pure sense of inquiring into itself with nothing apart. or the pure sense of mu, or just the pure sense, with no thoughts, conclusions, judgments, etc. And this is where things get interesting, when we really start to recognize we have an ability to drop right in to this, to pure consciousness, even for a fraction of a second, or 1 second, or a few seconds. This is when we start to realize that the tracks are literally everywhere. And maybe we're the one leaving the tracks, but you have to investigate a little further to figure that out. And the last line, not yet entering the gate, nevertheless, I have discerned the path. There's a trust there, a trust in life, a trust that suffering is not implicit in being human, that there actually is a path deeper into this presence, a path that will lead to a place where suffering has never touched, separation has never touched, doubt has never touched.